in contemporary Indian philosophy and also phenomenology. And more than that, he has his concerns are very clear concerns for justice and dignity, and it is very much is visible in his writings. He authored Heidegger and development in global South, and also editor of culture ontology and cultural ontology and self in pain. And recently it is came one more volume, which is teaching in unequal societies. In fact, this is about the teaching in unequal society is basically about the pedagogical practice of India and also ethical commitment in teaching the philosophy. Philosophy itself, we feel it is one kind of ethical understanding and critical understanding, but there also what kind of he has extensively very nice article has written in this thing. The is questioning the whole pedagogical practices and the curriculum, the way it is taught in India, the philosophy, the way it is constructed, and what is the possibility to seeing the one kind of the emancipatory and liberative potential of our knowledge systems when disseminating to the larger academic community or in general public. Yeah, today he's going to speak about it. In fact, is for a long time he's discussing about the communitarian politics and the problems and the complexity involved in communitarian politics and also the problems associated with this thing. As you know, communitarian philosophy is evolved, came into the prominence in late 80s with the critical understanding of the criticism against the liberal understanding of self and its politics, where it is atomistic self. They try to see the society as aggregation of individual, and where the communitarian argues that it is the self, it is embedded, it is not the abstract. People make meaning in a context where they are living in a social context. The Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor, and Michael Weiser and McIntyre, these are the prominent thinkers who are discussing. Of course, for a long time in a society, the Western society, Western discourses associated with the liberalism, they were making a position to with the liberalism of the Rawls. It is very much is revised and internalize some of the progressive elements, but that also it is how these people try to look critical about that work in a context of the very particularly multicultural societies where the problems of the cultural rights of the people are not addressed and also minority issues, how far it is excluded. In this context, communitarianism seems to be appealing, at least the way there's not one kind of modernity or not Western modernity or technological mediated modernity. There's a multiple modernities are there. And that's what it is not the individuals. Individual is means individual is carried with the past and culture and history, and one has to understand from that point of view. That's what very much is. Then the problem is that yes, it is a community is in a different levels. People are making the community either maybe religion, language, and political community. Whatever it is, always community also process of making community not only sharing history, culture, social practices, but is also it is in a process. It is not the rigid. It is always in a process of making. There's a danger of the having the community without and the critically try to evaluate, look at this practices. It may be ultimately ends as a one kind of reactionary kind of community. That positivity also there. That's why they're also critical about the one has to be morally evaluate the community and its practices. That is our argument also. The problem here is that yes, we are talking about keeping the setting the community against the individualism is all right, but there is a space where it is not the totally with most of the identity politics we are known very well, which are identified, which are both critical about the both liberalism and Marxism, and there they try to accepting their identity on the moral ground by criticizing the structural inequalities of the society. That way they are accepting their identity, making the identity. But there's a space it is there, it is between community and individual, and also it is not or pre and in the identity kind of thinking or process. There is a open community might be there, it is insufficient, unclosed, and also non-identitarian community, and that it is where community means it very well shared and also communicated. Such kind of situation it is there, but not necessarily always the communities are finished or enclosed, not like that. But there is a process which is there and all. It is the politics are there, but it is not articulated explicitly, and there's no communication in this context. How to most of the time this is a situation. It is not clear cut final product of this is a community. This way one has to work out. It is not like that. Most of the time, like the fuzzy states, very often used to see that, and like that kind of situation it is there. How to address what kinds of problems involved, and these are the issues where I believe, and mostly he tried to. I have no idea, but at the same time, by seeing the abstract, he will try to reflect on this kind of situation, how to understand this thing. As I told, he has mostly taken from the phenomenological kind of the positions, and also critically try to look at the way they try to look at starting the debate with the Jean-Luc Nancy, and further he tried to moving towards the Derrida, post-modernist, post-structuralist, Derrida and other people. You want to look at the idea of the community, and for keeping the interest of the larger political community, and that way relating to the present society, where we can locate for the idea of justice in relation to the community. I'll stop it here. Now I request to Siby just to speak on the topic such as the open community, a phenomenological perspective. This is a tentative title, not necessarily we have to be reflecting on exactly that like that. It is just we put just to make ourselves, it is a familiar, just open that one. There's open community and a phenomenological perspective. It is not strictly going in that direction, but it is, he may discuss some of the issues related to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Keshava. Can you hear me? Can anyone confirm? Professor Keshava?
Yes, you are audible, sir.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Professor Keshava and other colleagues of the Department of Philosophy, Delhi University, and other, I can see some other friends and colleagues in among the audience, research scholars of the department and others, students, friends. Thank you very much for inviting me to your Friday's seminar. I'll speak about 45 minutes. It is ironical, very ironical, that such a thing is possible due to this evil called the pandemic. So a virtual community is being formed because there's something that we do not like. So these contradictions of life sometimes have good possibilities as well. So let me straight away go to the topic that Professor Keshava and I fixed, as he says, in an open way. And the title that we have given to this talk is The Open Community, a Phenomenological Perspective. My concern is to talk about the discourse of community in French thought since the 1980s, as distinguished both from communism and from communitarianism of Taylor and Sandel and so on. And I'll speak very it's not a paper. This is a little, you can call it a lecture. So in a general way, and I will try to relate the discourse of community to contemporary political morality, as I understand. Before we go into the discourse of community per se in French philosophy, let me do a little bit of ground clearing or contextualizing this debate. In 1983, the French philosopher Jean-Luc Nancy published a very famous essay called The Inoperative Community. This was the trigger for the discourse of community, really. Later that year, let's say 2 months later, the French intellectual and literary theorist philosopher Maurice Blanchot, much older than Nancy at that time, Nancy died recently, replied with another essay called The Negative Community. In the same year, there was another big publishing event in the English language press with a book, famous book again, by the political theorist Benedict Anderson, who published Imagined Communities, Reflections on the Origin and Spread of Nationalism. This was also published in 1983. Nancy, Maurice Blanchot, their debate is very different from Anderson's. But all these debates are addressing the issue of the dissolution of community with modernity. And that's true even of communitarianism, even to a certain extent to communism. If we notice in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, becoming the modern self already means alienating oneself from natural consciousness, from traditional consciousness, and embracing the universal consciousness of freedom, equality, and so on, which is enshrined for Hegel in the modern state, in the nation state. For Hegel, this was not something traumatic, though he calls it alienation, because modern consciousness for him was to raise traditional community consciousness to its level or degree of universality permitted in it. But modernity as we know it has constitutively meant breakup of traditional communities and certain trauma or disenchantment which arises from this breakup. The alienation wrought by modern capitalism, for example, is the central theme of the early Karl Marx. So, Nancy's essay and the later debate emerged from that is the central focus of my talk today. It was mainly a critique of the breakup of traditional communities. And we know that the trigger for the breakup of traditional communities was liberal individualism. The modern subject is fully immanent, unrelated, insulated, atomistic individual, as Professor Keshava said. This individual delegitimizes the meaning of common living and even of common political practices like voting, paying taxes. This phenomenon of delegitimizing the delegitimizing common living is discussed very often with the term legitimation crisis, as in Habermas, Charles Taylor, and all. But the desire for community is inescapable in the Western horizon per se. There is a nostalgia for the lost Christian community of communion of the faithful with the mystical body of Christ. We can similarly say that the nostalgia for the loss of the pristine, originary Vedic community is driving Indian politics today. Now, after the dissolution of traditional communities, communism was the most genuine modern attempt to achieve what is called community. According to Nancy, however, real communism failed in this aim because it was driven by a philosophy of productionism, a philosophy of immanentism. And what does that mean? It means the ambition to produce and make immanent, make immediately real the essence of human beings Where? In the community of the workers, the proletariat. Jean-Luc Nancy hopes, however, as Jean-Paul Sartre and others in France, that communism's desire for community is still a very salutary goal, and it has undying relevance. So in the new community discourse, traditional communities, imagined communities of nations, real communist communities, as in Soviet Union or China, fascist and nationalistic communities, and communities envisaged by communitarianism of the variety of Charles Taylor and Sandel, they all represent a nostalgia for the lost communities of fusion and communion. They're all answers to the dissolution of traditional communities of fusion. And the community that we are speaking about is an answer to this dissolution of traditional communities. And the apparent alternatives are also answers, but they are not answers is the central part of this discourse of community. In all these conceptions of community, therefore, like in nation or communism, etc., there is a recurrent idea. And that recurrent idea is community means an affective fusion of people who share a natural or familiar affiliation or bond. Now, if we look at Nietzsche's writings, for example, the gay science, there is for the first time, I think, perhaps, there is an attempt to distinguish ever so hazily between love, in his own words, as possessive craving for each other among two people, and friendship, which is considered as a higher ideal of sharing without fusion. So this Nietzschean suggestion is taken up later by the French intellectual Georges Bataille. He takes the Nietzschean idea forward. He was disenchanted both by fascism and communism. He had in fact experimented with both these. He was the first to speak about communities of non-communion, open communities, as we call it today. But Bataille seemed to believe that communities without communion was never politically possible. It's too idealistic. It has to happen in the margins of society between perhaps two lovers who do not care much about what's going on, conforming to society. So this is a kind of background for the discourse of community that we're speaking about today. So let's come to Nancy. Nancy writes that community has not taken place, his own words, that phrase, not taken place. Community has not taken place. And so he says it was never lost or dissolved. What does that mean? According to him, to exist or to be already means to be in relation. To exist as finite beings inherently means need of the other. So we are not indivisible individual atoms, but we are klinomen. The klinomen is a term that he borrows from the ancient Greek atomist Lucretius. For Lucretius, klinomen is the unpredictable swerve of atoms towards other atoms, so that they in their movement they come to form unities and shapes. So for Nancy, we are inclination from one toward the other, his phrase. So our being, right from our birth, is tied to something other than our own self or its very being. The sense of self is always grounded contingently almost groundlessly in our relation to others outside us. Absolute immanence, therefore, is absolutely impossible. Attempt to produce and bring about a completely cohesive, a unified community is impossible because this process persistently goes on as long as we're alive. I'll quote from Derrida's Politics of Friendship, 1994 book. He's using the phenomenological idea of intentionality to articulate this idea of always in relation to others. Quote, I think, therefore I need the other in order to think. We already know that he's referring to the Cartesian cogito, but he's putting it in a completely different way in the phenomenological notion of, in terms of the phenomenological notion of intentionality of consciousness as consciousness always being about something, of something. So I think, therefore, I need the other in order to think. Quotation goes on. I think, therefore, the possibility of friendship is lodged in the movement of my thought insofar as it demands, calls for, desires the other. This ontology of the self is the basis of the new sense of community in Nancy and others. So when Nancy says community has not taken place, he's saying that all of the forms of community and their lamentation about the dissolution of community is wrong. The human being, for these philosophers, is not an individuality, but a singularity. So that's a term which is going to replace individuality in these philosophers. According to a commentator, singularity is the unique event of the taking place of meaning, but only by exposition, by sharing by sharing that exposes this uniqueness to others, and so allows its expression. Unquote. We are singular only in and through ecstasy, ecstatic relation to the other, going beyond the self. These are all very Heideggerian notions. Standing out. So the clinomen of singularity is the community, the new sense of community. Quoting Nancy, the one, the singular is more than one. One equals more than one because one cannot be counted without counting more than one. Unquote. So community is not communion or fusion arising from a natural bond. It is a finite co-appearing, in French, comparence of embodied beings in space, partes extra partes, the Latin phrase to say separated one from the other. So community is communication, community is exposure, community is exposition, community is expression. All these words with X, actually means standing out. Stare is standing, so standing out towards something else from ourselves. So community is disclosure to the other, who cannot be fixed beforehand as man, woman, native, national, or even as human. But because, so we can have friendship with animals. But because the other is like me, the other is like me, not because the other is resembling me, but and because the other resembles me, there is an attempt to recognize, as in the recognition debate. But here, the other is like me because she shares her otherness with me, difference with me, difference of her uniqueness, a singularity with me. And she also shares the terror of death, of finiteness with me. Hence, death, mortality, finiteness, as in Heidegger, is very important in this discourse of community, is central, crucial. God, in his immortality and indivisibleness, has no need of community. But human existence is by its very constitution, sharing the dynamic unfolding of meaning without any completion, and the possibility of sharing finite meaning in the face of the unshareable terror of death. We're sharing something unshareable because death is so personal. Any effort, political or otherwise, to bring about an immanent community of communion, produce a community, represents the cult of death. Genocide, the cult of death can come in terms of the genocide of impure members, as in Nazism, or it can come as suicide pacts, as in certain religious sects we often hear in America. Sometimes religious cults undertaking group suicide. So community for Nancy and all these philosophers destabilizes and delegitimates the cult of death. Therefore, community as communion is inoperative. That's Nancy's title of the essay. Inoperative, unworking, insufficient, incomplete, unavowable, non-immanent. In the positive formulation that we have done today, community is open. Blanchot writes more radically that and speaks about the negative community, the community of those who have no community. Therefore, as a finished product of fascistic or communistic nations, community is undone, community is betrayed, community is destroyed, community is contradicted. So in the age of the death of God, in our secular times, community in this sense takes the place of the sacred. It is resistance to completion and fixity of our relation to the other without the violence of naturalized notions of individual and communal selfhood. Now, we can see the traces of the Heideggerian ontology of myth sign being with in these in whatever we have said so far. But Nancy thinks that Heidegger himself, who glorified Nazism in 1933, his behavior at that time shows that he never realized the full meaning of his own idea of myth sign. The upshot of the meaning of myth sign is this for these philosophers. As finite, historical, situated beings, we incline towards proximate others who are nearby. And we produce communities of familiars. But this is a necessary accident of our finite fate. Our inclination towards others is potentially boundless, potentially infinite, though we are finite. We can finitely effectuate non-communing friendships with virtually anyone, any being, even animal. For example, when we speak in favor of the exploited, even animals, there is community unfolding without completion. Now, we also find a similar post-Heideggerian ontology of community in Agamben's 1990 book, The Coming Community. According to him, community is loving whatever singularity, any being. So whatever is a very important phrase for him. Whatever singularity without any specification of properties. The mere negation of identity, as in Blanchot, however, is not enough for Agamben. Blanchot speaks about negative community. That's not enough. The positive condition of belonging without any identity specification. So non-identitarian belonging is important for Agamben. Without any condition of belonging. For example, Shashi Tharoor spoke about Hindu, Hindustani, Hindi speaker. So that kind of identification is the problem. Any presupposition of a nation, language, or religion is not necessary in this sense of belonging. I'll refer to one more book, a 1998 book by the Italian philosopher Roberto Esposito. His book is Communitas, The Origin and Destiny of Community. Here, he disavows the early Heidegger's notion of authenticity, authentic, proper being, that he rejects. Eigenschlichkeit, he rejects. But he accepts the later Heidegger's notion of ereignis, which means the event. What is the event? The event of the happening or appearance or emergence of meaning to which human beings respond favorably. So this idea he accepts. Here, what is meant by communitas is not the anthropological idea of communitas in Victor Turner's writings, which means, the liminal experience of communion that people have when they, for example, take part, when, for example, supposedly primitive tribes participate in rituals, they have a liminal feeling of a community, forgetting their social status and so on. Not that kind of communion, feeling of communion is what communitas stands for, Esposito. Here it means sharing common obligations, munus, obligations, without any sense of the proper, without any sense of property. We must recollect that once upon a time only property class could vote, property, without any sense of the proper, as in traditional political communities, without immunitas. What is immunitas? Remaining immunized from the improper external substances. So without being immunized from externals, all substances, impure people, impure beings are welcome. We are hospitable to them. Our clinamen is not stopped because somebody is impure. So communitas is being dispossessed of the proper, of property, and appropriation of the new emancipating event of being and its obligations. That's the idea. This post-Heideggerian community, discursive community, is merged also with the Levinasian notion of alterity or otherness, especially in Maurice Blanchot's essay, The Negative Community. So a word about that. For Levinas, the excess that interrupts communion, even in Nancy's archaic community of clinamen or singularities, of inclining beings, is still alterity for Levinas. Now, Derrida is also generally very sensitive to the idea of alterity, the Levinasian concept of alterity. But in the Politics of Friendship, he argues that the self-other asymmetry is actually secondary to the originary harmony of sense, of meaning, circulated, for example, in language and received from our inclination towards others. So in a sense, even for Derrida, this minimal community, as he calls, a quasi-transcendental relationality with the other, which is available to us through language, is an ontological friendship before any actual friendship can happen, before even interruptions of otherness can come. This Derrida calls aimens or lovens, putting love and friendship together. So even the most originary difference for Derrida can manifest itself to human beings only in terms of this originary friendship of sense. So grounded in this kind of an understanding of community, a minimal community, Derrida deconstructs the traditional concept of friendship, which is the basis for communities or communion like nation. Ever since Aristotle, Derrida points out, friendship is based on familiarity gained through the interpretation of something cultural as natural. So naturalization of friendship leads to exclusionary and androcentric, man-centric views. The friend for Aristotle is the brother figure. One soul, two bodies. Women cannot be friends is the idea. So our concept of the nation, citizenship, all these are centered on autochthony, Tellurian rootedness, stock, blood, birth, property, language, religion, race, caste, sex. If we follow the new logic of community as we see in Derrida and Nancy and all, what Derrida calls immanence, the naturalized notions of friendship must be denaturalized. For Derrida, even the term community smacks of natural bond. And finally, one more reference to a book called, by Leela Gandhi in 2006. She's a granddaughter of Mahatma Gandhi, and she teaches, I think, in Duke University. She published a book called Affective Communities, which refers to the community debate that we are discussing today. And she shows that the friendship between C.F. Andrews and Mahatma Gandhi, that kind of friendship is actually is a friendship that happens outside the main understanding of friendship, in the margins. So she thinks these are, realizations of the idea of community that Derrida and all are speaking about. Now, I'm coming to the next idea that I want to the next step in my talk. That is next section. That is to relate this discourse of community with contemporary political morality. Open communities are the political necessities, if we notice, of modern nations, which are increasingly becoming multilinguistic, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multiracial, despite the fact that there are reactionary responses to this. Hence, a naturalized notion of a nation of friends, as in Aristotle, is becoming increasingly unviable. Many contributions are made for this kind of reality. For example, many negative contributions are made. For example, the global movement of people. And most of these people are refugees and migrants forced out of their homes by the many processes of modernity and capitalism. The political necessity of communities of difference in the age of, in fact, homelessness brings the stranger most distanced from us ceaselessly to our doorsteps, to our TV screens, to our digital screens, our mobile phones. The modern reality of singular plural is the phrase used by Nancy in a book's title. The reality of singular plural existence makes necessary the ideal of open community, in fact, which is ontologically a truer ideal than communities of communion. Now, the deeper ontoethical meaning of the modern reality of communities of difference is that excluding stranger others from the orbit of our power of affective closeness, owing to their radical otherness, is artificial, is unwarranted, to be rejected. Hence, what must be done is making oneself at home with strangers, making oneself at home with difference. Our inclination towards others, whoever they may be, is an infinite excess, in Levinas's words, that must be necessarily betrayed. Levinas. Why necessarily betrayed? Because this excess, this infinity has to be concretely limited in a political context. This is because we are historical beings. We are finite beings. We occupy space and time. We cannot experience the complete potential of infinity, but we can make up for it by establishing concrete communities without exclusionary principles. Whenever we consider political projects of encountering difference, the modern emancipatory project cannot be abandoned, cannot be left aside. So postmodernism, the supposed postmodernism cannot be a desire for pre-modernity, but a desire to encounter the modern condition in all honesty and seeing it to its logical conclusion. So the ontology of singular plural community that we have seen is now realizing itself concretely in and through the cruel processes of modernity. That's the irony, that's a paradox. So any talk of emancipation must address the question of singular plural existence. In this context, therefore, Agamben's focus on the spectacle of capitalistic society is interesting. He considers capital as a separation of the image from real concrete existence, and considering capital or the image as something sovereign through the structures of the state and its economy. This spectacle vitiates our belonging. That's the negative part. But Agamben is a thinker of the profane world, this world, concrete world. So capitalism is creating a single planetary class of petty bourgeois of which you and me are parts. What is the emancipatory part of this negative phenomenon is, for Agamben, that they, the petty bourgeois, embrace the improper. They dare to embrace the improper. They signal towards community without identities. So in capitalistic commodification of the body, for example, Agamben sees potential for emancipating the female body from traditional, cultural, stigmatized inscriptions. Similarly, we can think of other emancipations, whether it's of the transgender, of the gays, of religiously persecuted people, or whatever. So in other words, the emancipatory potential of the inescapable necessities of the communities of difference in modern nations lie in not closing our eyes to the modern processes, but seeing in them such potential that is not averse to difference. However, philosophers of the open community that we are speaking about today are averse to proposing any explicit politics. They fear that making incomplete communities politically real would be a project fated to be like real communism, like fascism, a work of death. Therefore, the political necessity of open communities due to the global mixing of populations must remain unstated for them, must remain non-immanent, should not be really realized, should remain unacted upon, a mere Geist, spirit pervading personal and socio-political spheres in an ontoethical sense. It is more meaning than real. But they also speak of the new left, the new progressive bloc. For them, this new bloc is primarily a challenge posed to naturalistic notions of community. For example, Nancy says the left, in his words, at the very least, that means that the political as such is receptive to what is at stake in community, unquote. And for him, the right is conservation, conservatism. What is being conserved? The status quo, and administering the orders that are there already in the status quo. Now, this we can apply to Derrida as well. So there the left would mean a desire for utopian community of denaturalized friendships without exclusion. Similarly, we can do with Esposito. There, the left would mean conceiving community without essentialist relations to the proper, to property. But without a clear political form, I think, that's my way, the open community that we are speaking about today cannot become a political reality. And there's no harm in thinking about it being a political reality. It's no non-immanentism, as in Nancy and all, and incompletion and openness must not be non-realism, must not be ephemeralism, merely a dream. So becoming deliberate, ethical, and political about the ontology of plural communities, plural singularities, can lead to, at least for us to resist against individualism, against totalization, against totalitarianism, against homogenization, against pining for fixed identities of blood, soil, self. Openness, plurality, justice, and struggle against values opposed to these are the marks of non-identitarian political ethics. So democratic political strategies and social movements that seek non-exclusivistic, non-totalizing common ends must be considered as instantiations of the new politics of community. Further, if we look at the Argentinian political theorist Ernesto Laclau and Belgian political theorist Chantal Mouffe, they argue that such political deployment of the new ideal community should be made possible. There is a need to take recourse to the agonistic politics of building new hegemonies of this kind of communities, according to Mouffe and Laclau. In this sense, we may say that all our attempts, even personal attempts to bring about friendships which are of this type, are actually irrelevant in contemporary politics. This means the logic of incomplete community, open and welcoming without any naturalizing principle of exclusion, must be the basis of democracies as we see them today. But they must also embrace the agonistic logic of building new non-identitarian hegemonies and peacefully oppose exclusivistic philosophies and strategies. What is wrong with that? This is a necessary strategy to prevent consolidation of exclusionary politics. Hence, resisting exclusionary principle is central to the politics of incomplete communities. But in the face of, if we look around in contemporary world, in the face of the brutal force indiscriminately unleashed by democratically legitimized establishments today, whose use of indiscriminate force is supported by an electorally significant population in huge countries like ours, the question of resistance becomes difficult, even irrelevant to a great extent. The situation now is different all over the world, not only in our country. Democratically powerful majorities mistreating sizable unpopular minorities. This has become the new norm. Agamben, in this context, proposes that personal resistance to such democratically legitimized majorities of closure is possible. For example, he refers to the character Bartleby in Herman Melville's short story of 1853 called Bartleby the Scrivener, Story of Wall Street. Here, Bartleby is a clerk who refuses to, a clerk functioning in a private capitalistic establishment. So he refuses to do the usual clerical jobs, saying, I would prefer not to, because he doesn't want to participate in the capitalistic establishment, though he is being employed by them. At the same time, Agamben also he's writing in 1990, 1 year after the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. So Agamben also refers to that massacre, that protest, as an example of non-identitarian collective resistance to totalitarianism. In any case, personal resistance is insufficient. Acts of resistance, personal, parousia or fearless speech, as Foucault would have it, civil disobedience, as Gandhi would have it, non-cooperation, again from our freedom movement, all these have the power to make powerful personal and collective statements about non-identitarian hegemonies. Gandhi, for example, galvanized such acts into successful political movements in the first half of the 20th century. And we must remember that he was the biggest advocate of Hindu-Muslim friendship at that time, despite all criticisms that are there about Gandhi today. Ambedkar, displeasing Gandhi and the Congress establishment of the time, articulated the cause of the Dalits in an unparalleled way. All these are, for me, examples of championing the politics of open communities, however imperfectly. So we have examples in our own heritage. So for the cultural permeation of the new politics of friendship, denaturalized forms of friendship need to become social and political movements. There has to be certain social sense prevailing for these ideas to percolate. A law, for example, is dysfunctional unless there is cultural acceptance of the law. Progressive legislation, like the law permitting women's entry into the Shabarimala temple, these remain dysfunctional because there is no cultural acceptance of denaturalized notions of community, of men and women being equal. The understanding of open community necessitates, we are coming to the conclusion, the understanding of the open community necessitates, in my reading, the inclusive counting of citizens in nation states without relying on chauvinistic, exclusionary principles and policies. I'll refer to a very significant passage in Derrida. In 1996, in a speech he gave at the International Parliament of Writers in Strasbourg on the cosmopolitan rights of asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants, Derrida points out that the critical question is how to limit the unconditional law of hospitality. The law of hospitality is unconditional. How to limit it? How to enact the betrayal? There is this betrayal unavoidable. How to enact it without losing the signature of the unconditional law? The activity of improving the law must take place between the moral space of the unconditional law of hospitality, which is, I'm quoting his words, offered a priori to every other, to all newcomers, whoever they may be, and the conditional laws of a right to hospitality as in Kant, without which the unconditional law of hospitality would be in danger of remaining a pious and irresponsible desire without form and without potency, and of even being perverted at any moment. He's speaking about perversion because he's referring to a passage in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the book called Judges 19, where a woman is offered to be raped instead of a man to keep the law of hospitality. There are similar instances of even offering the wife to the guest is there in Hindu lore as well. Now, the moral question for us today is whether the law will look for naturalized notions of friendship to include and exclude immigrants and refugees, or whether it will look for a denaturalized criterion to include and exclude. That's a crucial question. Accepting citizens mindful of the pressure of numbers or pressing nature of the claim is certainly a more denaturalized rather than naturalized notion of citizenship. A political community without communion. It is important to recognize that the ethics of unlimited hospitality for the stranger has to be necessarily betrayed, as Levinas says, for a practical life of ethical political norms, gestures to have any meaning. Accordingly, democracy is supposed to mean equality of all free beings. But in the necessities of practice, the quintessential democratic citizen is the representable subject of the national majority, decided by the one person, one vote electoral enumeration mechanism. Derrida's proposal is of a utopian democracy, which is, according to him, a matter of thinking and alterity, otherness, without hierarchical difference at the root of democracy. It would be a democracy that attempts continuously to reduce the hierarchization of difference, the othering of those from the margins. Fostering and respecting the singularity of others without hierarchization is a utopian conception, but not an empty one, because there is no absolute principle for decision. That's what we are realizing in the that's a basic, post-structural later phenomenological insight, that we are speaking from contingent grounds, abyssal grounds, groundless grounds. Now, if that were the case, there is only the possibility of taking decision, even by violent suspension of the law, the set principle, which is a law, in the face of the suffering other. So this would be the kind of democracy that we are getting from this discourse of community, according to me. Thank you. And I welcome questions.
Yeah, thank you, Siby. Very elaborated and also very insightful lecture. And also relating to the what is the need of the hour, you try to prompt through your lecture. Yes, there's a need to be the open society. One has to recognize that open community as a plural political reality. And there is a political singularity. One has to look at the political singularity against the plural singularity against the individualism. But we have seen in a society where we are living always there's attempt to the leading to moving towards the idea of the totalitarianism. Even the differences are reduced to the some kind of the same or totality. Of course, even the politics of philosophy, how it is working out, even Levinas also very often try to discuss. There's a need to be resist this kind of act of totalitarian, or the other way, some kind of fascist kind of ideas where democracy undermined. When come to democracy, is a very fascinating word, and in the name of democracy, is ultimately is what happened. It is democracy reduced to the majoritarianism as celebrated the democracy. In fact, many people also objected that idea. The idea of the democracy is also the celebration of the equality. It is not the democracy is not. It is the celebration of the majority. It has to be serious concern about the minority. And against this kind of totalitarian, you know it very well, the democracy ultimately leading to one kind of the post-truth societies. It leads to some kind of populism. The populism based on some kind of construction of the lies, based on lies or half truth, and ultimately it is going towards some kind of instead of the relatedness to the other, it is creating the one kind of the gap between the people, and also it leads to some kind of hatred. And this context, there is a need to be assert oneself against the resisting this kind of approaches of totalitarianism or populism, or the kind of politics, either the whatever the forms earlier it might be there in the name of democracy or in the name of some kind of religious authority. And this is in fact the statements of the resistance. It is reveals some kind of the declaration of the self. In this context, is very much is argued for this open community also necessitate to necessitate the inclusion of the inclusive account of the citizens, and that level also not only try to theorize ourselves from the, and also need to be look at the liberative potential of the larger unrecognized and the pluralistic communities. One has to be to realize in a larger context of the democracy or any kind of political project. That's what I understood. This thing, of course, you know it very well, very systematically build up this kind of conclusion, what I read so far. And now it is open for the discussion. You may raise, you may discuss. Many of friends also there from outside, Upendra and Koshi Tarakan Payas from Assam University, and Koshi Tarakan from Goa University, Upendra from Indore, IIT, and many other friends also there. Some people, known friends are there. And now it is open for the discussion. Yes, Supendra, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Siby George, for the interesting talk. I have a simple question. Of course, it's a question of the open community. So, but this idea, this phrase "open" is used in several domains of human knowledge or several domains of human understanding. We keep encountering this thing where open societies, open cultures, etc., etc., and the concerns of what you have discussed add up to the understanding of the open community in terms of whether it is acceptance or resistance or in terms of revolution or in terms of transformation, etc., etc. So, and you have used certain in the later part of your lecture, you have used unconditional law for hospitality and contingent grounds and groundless grounds. This is what is more interesting. But in the as I understand it, if we link it to political or anti-foundationalism, and very much discussed after the fall of the socialist experiment, especially, and thinkers like Roberto Esposito talks about impolitical. So how this open community, and there are several discussions that you are more aware of than me about the reframing the political or reinventing the political, all those things. But and going by the spirit of Rancière's ontological nature of equality, for example, let us say that and which is possible only via the realm of the political. So how this open society would create a kind of a mood of the political. It has its own image of the political. That is if it is, then what? How would you look at that openness? So openness is basically again a contingent, of course, always a contestable paradigm. So I would like to you to reflect more upon that openness of the community. Openness. So openness is in that sense of anything goes by. Can there be? For example, I'll just stop here by giving an analogy. I think in Rawls refers to Isaiah Berlin, maybe in political liberalism or atheism of justice. I don't remember much exactly. He says that was talking about a space called society, where, for example, he takes the example of if the society has 1,000 people, then we cannot validate 1,000 paradigms. That is impossible. So the whole idea is that there is a kind of an implicit cancellation goes on, like the Occam's razor kind of stuff. So how we then all these things, of course, bring us to a crossroads, a standstill of how do we understand all these ideas of tolerance or to say agree to disagree or some kind of plurality. All these are all fashioned paradigms, but we don't know how to live with these. These are all not yet experimented from the Socratic point of view. So how do you respond to this open community?
Okay. Thank you, Upendra. Upendra has listened to this talk earlier as well to some extent, at least some part of it. And thank you for that question. So that's the expected question, and that's an important question in relation to this idea. Very often, I also think about that. So that's why it's because of this fear that I introduced Derrida's idea of limiting the unconditional law of hospitality. Open community or the community of, in fact, this positive formulation perhaps will not be looked kindly upon by Nancy and others of open community. It reminds us of, Popper's open society and its enemies. In any case, we used it, Professor Keshava and I discussed and decided this title, thinking that also gives a kind of positive positing of this idea. We are in one thing that you observed was about post-foundationalism. So our realization that there's no absolute political principle to rely upon. At the same time, this ontology of the human being that we cannot deny, that the human being is always a relation, a finite being into a kind of infinite mode of relating to the other. which can go in all directions without, though contingently and finitely we are bounded by space and time on certain people. If we meet with others, we can relate with them, is the idea. So if we have to invite, if new people have to come into our framework of relations, that's really possible, is what this debate on community is telling us. Now, from this perspective, so there is the possibility of infinite possibilities, infinite relations, and unconditional hospitality that is there. The excess that we always experience is there. But how do you limit it is a question that Derrida asks. That's why I wanted to end the talk with that, referring to that. And without this limiting, according to Derrida, this whole idea of the unconditional hospitality will become irrelevant. And it could make it could take many forms which are themselves unmeaningful, as the reference to the biblical passage in Judges 19 shows. Now, what exactly is the limiting principle? And what exactly should be the law? So, for example, I referred to the non-exclusionary counting of citizens, non-exclusionary principles of calling somebody a citizen. Now, that much is what we can do, I think, when we talk about community in this sense. So there has to be law, there has to be limit, and these laws have to be continuously we have to come to them, but the laws will have to be non-exclusionary. The laws will have to be looking at the suffering or pain of the other who is different from me. So these are some of the questions that will help us to decide what is an ethical law from this perspective. What more can we say? See, for example, I would say that if a law is passed in relation to my comfort zones, and my would mean the self, and the self in the plural sense, that the self and whoever the self is immediately associating itself with, my community, my group, my nation, etc. Can a law see beyond that is a question that will become relevant from this point of view. So are we using non-exclusionary methods to count citizens or call people citizens, or with respect to not only citizenship and non-citizenship, with respect to every other matter? So I want to leave it at that. For the rest, one has to think about. I have not thought about what are the other practical consequences of this.
Yeah.
But this is where we can.
That response.
Yeah.
I think I may be making a little bit of a weird remark on this, but maybe it is a difference between potentialities and possibilities. Maybe the limitations that, of course, if we're referring to Derrida in terms of hospitality, is from the point of a political possibility beyond which I think it is impossible to look for, or impossible to accept those things. But from the, of course, it's like, of course, in theory it is possible, but in practice this is what is possible only. So maybe as long as, of course, we talk about, of course, you are talking about refugees or you are talking about immigration, all those things. That discussion takes one particular shape. But when you are talking about the same within about the same issue with respect to a kind of an internal radical transformation of a particular society. So the discussion of hospitality takes a different turn, because there, of course, the question of what is the global justice or whatever people keep talking about that do not arise, but it is more of a kind of a reconciliation kind of stuff. I reconcile or for a retributive justice or all that kind of discussion. Maybe I'm just making kind of an odd comparison here, But I see the difference because the whole element of hospitality has two levels of its relevance and discussion.
Yes, I fully agree. No, that's why I understand Derrida as exactly meaning the same. And we can apply, we don't need to make very radical distinction between the two levels. Of course, we politically, you are a political philosopher, so you might always make that distinction. But from where does exclusionary principles come? Do they come within communities or within nations? They do come. They do come. Do they come within relationships of two individuals? They do come. We look down upon another person because of certain exclusionary ideas, or because our ability to be open to the other person and his or her radical difference is not possible for us. So that's important. And even when we think of, for example, the debate on reservation in India. So from this point of view, I suppose it's very easy to make sense of that whole debate. As far as the political morality of the debate is concerned, not the specifics, but the political morality of the debate is concerned, that is a requirement of justice, because not in a theoretical or transcendental sense, but in a concrete sense of a justice that wants to avoid the exclusionary principle, a justice that wants to institutionalize a non-exclusionary principle. Does that make sense, Upendra?
Yeah, perfect, sir. Thank you.
Yes, Aparna, go on.
Yes, sir. I'm student of Dr. Upendra.
Great.
I am student of Dr. Keshav Kumar also from Pondicherry. So
Okay.
when I was listening to your talk, I was not expecting you to end the lecture like that. I mean, not like that. When I was listening, it raised curiosity in me. I wanted to listen more from you. So I have heard you saying in last sentence something related to violence in society. So my question is that, can we take violence as a possibility for a society of change? Is there any possibility of violence in society and in the what to say? Is there any possibility for violence in society for a radical change? What is your take on it?
Aparna, thank you. And we have met in that particular seminar. So
Yes.
Yeah. Aparna, if you ask me, that's why I began to say that even resistance is becoming increasingly difficult in a typical democratic society like ours. Because resistance is easy if a majority wants to resist a position, an elitist position of some sort. But resistance of persecuted minorities is becoming a very difficult proposition, because the state can use its majoritarian argument. It can say that we are an elected government, and we have an electoral majority, and they can use a law. So the citizen of this variety, a persecuted minority, is the typically other that we are speaking about in a context like the ideal community that we have been discussing today. If you're asking me whether violence is justified for change in political society, we will, at least I will have to say yes. Because why? Why? Because the status quo and the status quoists very often say that violence is unjust, But nothing changes without aggressive questioning, and sometimes which take violent forms. So at least I would like to say that in some of the questions of assertion of rights, especially rights of people from the margin, it is not that the use of violence is unethical or unjustified. But I do not want to propose a violent solution because the state's power, the state's use of violence cannot be matched by the violence of the people from the margin. And there are a number of cases and evidence for this. So we are not speaking about ethics, but we are speaking of strategy. So it's not merely that the state uses violence to when there is protest or assertion of rights from the margins, but the state uses not only violence but a whole lot of justificatory claims and narratives, and everything is ruled by what is the narrative that is having acceptance among people. So if we go by all that, there is all the more, what I tend to think is that it is very often the case that the assertion of the claim to certain rights are seen as unjustified and unethical because of the narrative that is ruling. So the violence of narrative and the real violence of the state through statist means, through means that are supposedly legitimate, are quite daunting. Therefore, the most strategic way to approach to have rights is to have rights realized is to have alliances, to bring like-minded people together, to build a narrative that is going to challenge the mainstream narrative, etc. Aparna, do you agree?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Yeah.
Because I was also thinking like how far violence can be justified in societies, because that is one of the constant thought I have in my mind. There are kinds of violences, like violences that happens during protest marches, violences that happens during demonstrations, etc. So my personal thinking also is like, can these violences be justified? So I got an answer. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and we have to also distinguish many kinds of violence. Is not only when somebody beats us with a lathi, but violence is there pervading in our system. Violence of injustice and violence of language and violence of gendering and violence of all kinds, sexual and other violences are pervading in our cultural ethos. So those must be figured, and those must be also figured in our characterizing of physical violence. That would be the way I see it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Keshava, are there questions?
Yeah. Any more questions? Yes, violence in terms of this, not necessarily. Very often you used to see violence in terms of the physical form, but most of the violence taking place in the name of structural form.
Yes.
That is mostly in psychological forms. It may be time and again it is reinforced in our everyday life.
Aniket Bo wants to ask a question.
Yes, Aniket.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Thank you for the precious words and the precious words that you gave us today and gave me today. So, what was the 1998 book which you referred?
That is Esposito's book called Communitas. What is the subtitle? Communitas. The Origin and Destiny of Community, Roberto Esposito, an Italian philosopher. Yeah?
Yes.
So here the idea of the proper and the improper is very central. That's the idea I picked up. Aniket, you want to ask something more on that?
So not currently. I mean, there are not very well framed up questions right now, but something which I am able to gather up still is what are your thoughts, sir, on this, on the whole situation that the community currently is in, the whole community and the whole nations are currently in, and the COVID situation, and how can the communities develop more fluently, or or more develop more in a healthy way?
COVID situation. Thank you. My response to that is two. One interesting thing with COVID situation is we have developed a positive, even an ethically justifiable idea of social distancing. And we are trying to posit this idea of social distancing as an idea of community. So if you care for the other, if indeed you say that you relate to the other, then you better distance yourself from the other. In normal times, we say that even a doctor, a medical doctor, a physician, his or her touch of the patient, a patient who comes in pain and in illness, the doctor's touch is very important. Now we are saying, with this new social scenario, we are saying that if you care for the other person, for the patient, then you don't touch. That's one part of the COVID scenario. And we can say that here an idea of community is emerging, an idea of relation as physical separation. That's one part. Another part is the way in which social distancing, etc., has actually gone in the last 2 years that we see. For example, in IIT campus, we had many debates about how the workers are treated, how the workers are, especially daily wage workers, especially workers who are in construction work, etc., are treated by institutions and processes, and whether the institutions and the privileged members of the IT community, whether they have any thought really about these people. So social distancing has become mere quarantining oneself from all kinds of issues and all kinds of people who are, there was that time when many people were walking into their homes. So at that time, there was this debate about quarantining and social distancing as simply looking away from these problems by the privileged and the elite. So these are two, and the latter part of the debate is very, very important. And that became the central part of the debate, I suppose, later, because that became so crucial. And we today know that there is grave unemployment. And who are unemployed? Those who are unemployed are not like you or me. You, I do not know, many students, but not people like us in the very, very formal sector, but people who are in the most informal of sectors. So these are the people who got affected, people who walked several kilometers and reached their homes, people who lost their jobs, and people who do not have the ability to speak and express and impress the well-heeled elite community whose voice is taken in the newspapers and in the surveys and in the data. So this is the aspect of the community. So the community in the sense that we are speaking about is, for example, these philosophers speak about this sense of community emerging in the they call it literary communism, emerging in writing. So you write and people read your book, and so there is an emergence of a sense of being together in this understanding when they share these words. And of course, writing in the Derridean sense is not only writing in words, but in the transaction of symbols and in the inscriptions of meaning. So in all these ways, the COVID situation is showing us the ugly face of looking away from the other. Aniket, I do not know if I have answered your question in any way. Anto Varghese wants to ask.
Thank you, Professor Siby, for the nice presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, Professor, my question is something related to your presentation, which may not be directly connected, but then it forms the background. Nancy was working so much in association with Lakul Abad, a philosopher, a friend, a literary figure. So they had formed something called a research center and so on. They began a kind of initiated discussing on political themes and so on. So they make a distinction between la politique and le politique. So the political and politics. So I think, is it because of the Heideggerian framework that both of them they were into, that now with the closure of metaphysical closure, they speak about that today we can no more speak about politics, but we can only speak about the political. So is it because of that Nancy's that Heideggerian framework that although he formulated something called singular plural and the community which is inoperative and so on, yet he was not able to come out of that sloppy field, how to concretely enter into the politics. And therefore, as I analyze all these thinkers, they have been so much influenced by the Heideggerian framework, but all the same, they wanted to come out of it, but then they are unable to come out of it. But I feel that in this case, a double reading of Levinas proposes a better, puts us in a better framework, very especially today people are not so much entering into a kind of thinking of Levinas. It is rarely discussed, maybe because he's seen as a religious thinker and so on. He speaks about the satire and the sociality and so on, and the Ilia in a different way, ilaity and so on. So that contributes a better framework for a kind of a theoretical framework for today's political understanding and the community in a better shape. And that's what I understand, I think.
Thank you, Anto. See, the Heidegger, of course, Heidegger was into Nazism. He was a registered member of the party and so on. But the Heidegger that we read in English language, the Heidegger that emerged after the 1940s, is through a dicta that happened in France. So, of course, Heidegger, in many senses, was a political conservative. The French reading of Heidegger, of course, is very left kind of a reading. Is that the reason why they could not come out of the political to concrete politics? I don't know. Will taking recourse to Levinas help you to concretize or come out from the political to politics? Again, I do not know. Because, when I read Levinas, for example, I read both these philosophers. Though Levinas is our political philosopher is our ethical philosopher par excellence in 20th century continental thinking, and the philosopher of the other. We can also find many instances in Levinas's writings, especially in his interviews, which are very surprising, which are completely anti-other. For example, we can see statements in Levinas about against the yellow people, the Mongoloid stock. We can find statements against the Africans. We can find eulogizing and glorifying the Jewish and the Hellenistic and Hebraic civilization, which has emerged in the West. For example, in a philosophical essay called The Meaning and Sense, also Levinas speaks about it is this very Western thinking which is criticized, which alone can give us the philosophy of the other, etc. So I have after going through these ideas and thinking about it for quite long, I have come to this conclusion that we must look, as students of philosophy, we must look at these corpuses, philosophical corpuses as in Heidegger, Nietzsche, or Levinas, or Karl Marx, or anybody. We should criticize them biographically, etc. But we must also look at these works as corpuses. A corpus means an oeuvre where certain ideas are coming to play through the whole life history of a person. And this is given to you for interpretation. This is a significant corpus. It is given to you for interpretation, and we better consider the author as dead. Just as God is dead, we consider the author as dead. And we see what is in play in the realm of ideas there. What are the connections that are going on? And how that can be reinterpreted and reinterpreted in relation to meanings that emerge for the reader today. That's the way I see it, Anto. So I don't want to associate any necessary connection between the inability of the thinkers of community to come to politics, concrete politics, and remaining at the level of the political. I don't want to find any necessary connection between that and so, for example, there are people like Robert Barnasconi who write about these prejudices and biases in Western philosophers. He prefers Levinas and Levinas's idea of radical alterity as. But I have been I more and more tend to see both these oeuvres going together in many ways. And I recently also published an article called Sympathizing with Stranger, a rereading of Heidegger. The understanding of the idea of empathy in Heidegger's writings. So, but of course, Levinas, inasmuch as Levinas has the idea of the other and the idea of Letaia and justice, etc. So it's an important contribution. But one main problem in Levinas is humanism. He's not a post-human thinker at all. He remains at the level of humanism, be it a humanism or the other. Whereas Heidegger gives you a vantage point to enter into, current climate crisis and things like that. And also, if you take Levinas along seriously, and you get a good perspective, which is ethical in relation to the human being and others, and ethics in relation to the environment and animals, etc. And concrete politics, in which continental philosopher do you really see concrete politics? Neither do we see in continental philosopher, except the Frankfurt School. We do not see it in any of the phenomenologists, or we see only in Rancière, even Rancière and a few others like that. Jean-Luc Nancy is a political philosopher, but concrete politics is an Achilles heel even in his Rancière, I have not read so much. Upendra might know, but even their concrete politics might be a problem, is what I guess. So this is left to reinterpretation for us today. So I think thinkers like Laclau, Judith Butler, all these people are important when we think about concrete politics in relation to the post-foundational ideas that emerge from Heidegger, Nietzsche, Foucault, Derrida, Levinas, Anto.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. No, thank you, Siby. And also a very serious discussion took place, very genuine questions raised, and also very much relevant to the contemporary times. It is not just for the sake of questioning the lecture. It is very much is related to our everyday social life. And we are thankful to you on behalf of the Department of Philosophy. We expect you for some many more meetings in future. From the Department of Philosophy will definitely invite you. And I'm also thankful to the students and other friends who joined on the online platform. Now we are concluding this session. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Keshava and all our colleagues and friends. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.